I want to welcome you from Christian Education Ministries as we join Dawn Malloy, Dr. Dawn Malloy, as she speaks on ministering to families of children with disabilities. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight, Dawn.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our guest speaker, Dr. Dawn Malloy, is the Director of Children and Family Ministries at Church of the Atonement in Silver Springs, Maryland. Prior to her employment in this role, she worked as a volunteer in her home church, directing VBS programs, teaching, and actively participating in music and drama teams. Professionally, Dawn was on the faculty of the Special Education Department at the University of Maryland for nearly 20 years, and with a focus on teacher preparation, student advising, and research on education of students at risk for school failure. In her ministry, Dawn is committed to programs that reach across generations and abilities, and is thrilled to be coming back home to the world of disabilities for tonight's talk. I want to thank you very much for coming this evening, and to all our guests who are here, thank you for joining us. At this time, I'll be turning it over to Dawn.
Thank you, Judy. Well, our goal for tonight is to provide foundational information for ministering to and with people with disabilities. Tonight we're going to be covering a whole lot of information, and we are going to make some broad brush strokes across a lot of different topics. I apologize if we're not going to be able to get into too much detail, but the idea of ministering to and with people with disabilities is a really broad topic. So we want to kind of give you some broad brush strokes tonight. We're going to start off by looking at what I call that one thing. And then we're going to get into some language, terminology, and prevalence and categories of disability. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of disability, from exclusion to inclusion. Then we are going to talk about how we are going to bring everyone to the feast. We're going to talk a little bit about some basic etiquette. We're going to talk about ministry to and with individuals with disabilities. And then we're going to return to talk a little bit about that one thing again. Well, as Judy mentioned, my background in working with individuals with disabilities goes pretty far back. I've been working professionally in the disability field for 30 years. I worked as a special ed teacher. I've got a PhD in special education with a focus on learning disabilities, 20 years at the university, 6 years in children and family ministry with a volunteer before that. And as I was preparing for this webinar, I just got to a point where I just said, what do I know? What do you need to know? And I felt very, very overwhelmed with just the whole topic and these questions. And I was just so relieved when I read the words that Paul said in 2 Corinthians 2. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And that just spoke to me to say that, you know, you don't have to know everything. You don't need to be eloquent about everything. What you need to know is that one thing. And I really love the way the blind man in John 9 said, you know, that he just gets us back to that one thing. I was blind, but now I see. And what we need to know as we're trying to grapple with how do we work across different ability levels, and the one thing we need to know as people working in the ministry is Jesus Christ and him crucified. And we just need to keep in mind, we've got a great commission. He's given us a job. His job that he's given us is to share his grace and love with all the world. And all the world includes marginalized people who are living in our own society. And so if we want to think about who are those marginalized people, well, in Jesus's day, he showed his love for all people when he was dining with outcasts. And in our own society today, some of our outcasts might be people that you might refer to as the crippled boy, the deaf girl, the blind, the epileptic, that special person. But as compassionate as this list may be, there is a problem with this list when we look at it. And I want to draw your attention to what you see first in the list. And what you might see when you talk like this is you see the disability or the exceptionality first, rather than the person. Jesus put people first. He didn't focus on all their failings. He focused on them as beloved people, created in God's image. And so when we talk about people with disabilities, we want to use what's called people first language. People first language is used to speak appropriately and respectfully about an individual with a disability. People first language emphasizes the person first, not the disability. Some examples of people first language are, you don't say the disabled or the handicapped, you say the person with a disability. Instead of saying the epileptic, you say the person with epilepsy or seizure disorder. Instead of saying the crippled, the lame, the deformed, invalid, spastic, all terms that are very out of date, you say person with physical disability. Instead of saying somebody is confined or restricted to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound, you would say person who uses a wheelchair. One word that you should never use is what we call the R word. That is a derogatory, hurtful word. When you hear somebody say, that was so retarded, or I was so retarded to do that, they're not offering a compliment. They are using that term in a way that's hurtful either to themselves or to other people. When we talk about people of any ability, we want to always remember the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. You would not want to be called retarded, and neither does a person with an intellectual disability. There's a great website that's there on the screen, r-word.org, which has as its mission to spread the word, to end the word. And there's some great vignettes on there, some great ways of talking about this with people who might need to be educated about not using that word. Instead, you would use the term person with an intellectual disability or person with Down syndrome, if that's specifically what they have. The correct term is just simply descriptive. There's no need to make life difficult. Now, a lot of people ask, well, do I use the word handicap or do I use the word disability? Well, that's a great question. I want to distinguish those two terms for you briefly. A handicap is a context-specific physical or attitudinal constraint or obstacle. So, for example, stairs could be a handicap for a person who uses a wheelchair or even pushes a stroller. In contrast, a disability is a condition that's intrinsic to an individual. It might be caused by an accident, trauma, genetics, age, or disease, which may limit a person's mobility, hearing, vision, speech, or mental function. I like the term disability because it has the word ability inside of it. And it reminds me that I personally, a person without a disability currently, could also be called temporarily able-bodied. If I were to live long enough, I will most likely develop a disability at some point in my life. The emphasis in the term disability also allows me to think about programming across abilities and multiple abilities. I want to share with you a little bit about the prevalence and categories of disability in the US. 20% of all US citizens identify as having a disability, according to the 2010 US Census. 13% of students, that's 6.6 million students, ages 3 to 21 in our public schools, are identified for special education services. Most people with disabilities have no visible sign of their disability. A lot of times people think about disability and they think immediately of somebody who is going to be hard to communicate with or who might need special assistance because they might use a wheelchair. But the majority of people you would not even know have a disability. Categories of disability are now described by the frequency of occurrence in the population. We describe categories of disabilities as being high incidence or low incidence, instead of by severity. Our old terms were mild, moderate, and severe disabilities. Instead, now it's high or low. One thing that I love, I heard one time, somebody said, when we used to use the term somebody has a mild disability, someone said, well, there is no such thing as a mild disability to the person living with it. So what is a high incidence disability? Well, first of all, a high incidence disability represents 80% of all students ages 3 to 21 who are identified for special education. It is often hard to distinguish students with high incidence disabilities from students without disabilities, especially in non-school settings like church. Students with high incidence disabilities often display a combination of academic, behavioral, and social problems. They can meet the same standards as students without disabilities, especially when highly structured interventions and supports are put into place. Some of the common labels and terms you would hear associated with high incidence disabilities include learning disabilities, which account for 35% of all students identified for special education, speech and language impairment, which is another 20% of students identified for special education, mental health impairments. Interestingly, 25% of 13 to 18-year-olds are identified with anxiety disorders, and 6% of those students are identified as having severe anxiety disorders. Intellectual disabilities for students who are high functioning with an tested IQ above 50 are categorized in the high incidence disabilities area. And then students with other health impairments account for 13% of students identified for special education. These would be people with limited vitality or alertness due to chronic or acute health problems, such as diabetes or asthma or cancer. But again, for these students, you would have the same goals as students without disabilities educationally. In terms of low incidence disabilities, this accounts for 20% of students identified with disabilities. Again, this is going to refer to the prevalence in the population and not to intellectual ability. People with low incidence disabilities have typically received some type of special education service since birth. This would include students with hearing impairments, including deafness, visual impairments, including blindness, autism spectrum disorder, which is the fastest growing disability category currently. And this is a huge range of people. When you hear that somebody's on the spectrum, they could be incredibly high functioning to the degree that you wouldn't even know that they have a disability, all the way to people who are really significantly impacted. Low incidence disabilities also include people with orthopedic impairments, including people who would use wheelchairs, and then people with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities with an IQ tested below 50, or people with multiple concurrent disabilities. People with low incidence disabilities, again, may or may not have a developmental delay requiring alternative goals for education. So in summary, when we talk about disability, we are talking about a huge spectrum of people and services. Most people with disabilities have absolutely no visible sign of being different. So in order to understand how to minister to people with disabilities, we should know a little bit about some societal trends and laws that have shaped our current views in society regarding accessibility. So right now I'm going to take you through a very brief history that will take us from an attitude of exclusion to inclusion in the United States today. We're going to start with the Civil Rights era. Before 1975, there were no federal requirements that students with disabilities needed to attend school, or that schools should make an effort to teach students with disabilities. In 1968, when the civil rights era was really at its full force, a very important law was passed for education, and that was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA. And what this law did was it granted equal access to students across the U.S., regardless of family economics. And a program that you'll hear about today, Title I programs that focus on families that are economically disadvantaged, those are still in place today, dating back to this law in 1968. In 1973, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act granted equal access to public services for individuals with disabilities. And this was another very important landmark case. And also during this time, stirring up the soup was a whole lot of lawsuits, litigation that was launched by parents who were demanding equal access to public education for their children with disabilities. And then in 1975, this is really the birth of special education, PL 94-142 was passed, which was called the Education for the Handicapped Act. And it's now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And some of the key components of this particular law really have some applications that we can use in ministry that we're going to talk about a little later this evening. And what PL 94-142 did was it provided free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment with an individualized education program for students with disabilities. Also during this time, a major thing that was happening in society was in the 1970s and 1980s, institutions were being closed. So during this deinstitutionalization period, people with disabilities were being taken out of institutions and put back into general society, living in either group homes or in their own family homes, or unfortunately, some ended up out on the streets. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And some of the key parts of that act that have impact for us in churches are the idea of physical access and workplace accommodations, which help us understand some things that we can do to accommodate individuals in non-school settings. So one thing that this past 50 years has done for people with disabilities is it has allowed everyone to come to the feast. And so we have moved from exclusion to inclusion as a society. And this has just such a beautiful application for us in church settings. You know, when we think about the feast that God provides for us, for his creation, and we really have now a missional requirement to answer Jesus's Great Commission, to reach people who need to hear of his grace across all ability levels. But this is going to take us understanding that this might be a continuum. We're going to apply principles of appropriate, least restrictive, and individualized. And these terms come from IDEA. Well, when you go to a feast, you need to know the etiquette. So if we're going to bring people with disabilities to our feast, here are some rules for etiquette. Talk to people directly and not to their companion or helper. Make eye contact. Be patient when an individual is using a communication device or must seek for words. Don't try to finish their sentences. If you must ask someone about their disability, be sensitive and show respect. If the person declines to discuss it, don't probe. It is okay to offer assistance. Just ask first. The worst someone can do is say no thank you. When you do offer assistance, do so in a dignified manner with sensitivity and respect. If your offer is declined, don't proceed to give assistance. If the offer is accepted, listen carefully and follow instructions carefully. People with disabilities have been using helpers all their lives, and they'll tell you exactly what's needed to get around. Treat adults as adults. Do not talk down to people with disabilities. Avoid terms that imply that people with disabilities are overly courageous, brave, special, or superhuman. People with disabilities would like equal treatment, not special treatment. They have names, they're not just someone's buddy, and they are people first and disabled second. Well, a lot of what we would do to accommodate people with disabilities will benefit many people. This is a principle called universal design. And I like to think of this as the what you do for the least of these, you do for me principle. So, some places where we might apply universal design in our churches. First of all, in welcoming. Are our physical spaces accessible? Some examples would be having curb cuts, ramps, and elevators to be able to get into the building and around the building. Welcome people by name. Refer to people by name and not by euphemisms such as buddy or special. When you're worshiping, some ideas for universal design and worship. One of the things that I love that our pastor does is he invites children with young families and individuals with disabilities to sit closer to the front of the sanctuary. This is kind of counterintuitive for a parent, myself included, when you've got kids who you know are wiggly. But when they get closer to the front, they will be able to attend better. We use a worship bulletin that has icons for non-readers, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute on our next slide. You might consider having alternate worship spaces. We now have really good audio and visual feed to our chapel, which is a smaller area where people can get up and move around more easily and with more freedom than in the sanctuary. Projected lyrics are great, but watch that your projected lyrics have good contrast. Sometimes I see lyrics that have such beautiful backgrounds, but you can't actually read the words because there's not a strong enough contrast between the letters and the picture behind them. Another thing that I love that our church does is that we also provide song sheets, including large print song sheets for people who can't see the projected lyrics. And another thing that our pastor does that I love is that he emails the sermon, usually the day before, so that people who maybe have hearing issues or need some extra visual support in following the sermon can follow along on an iPad or their phone, or print the sermon ahead of time so that it's easier for them to follow along on the lessons. In terms of teaching some principles of universal design that can apply to both worship and Sunday school, include visuals to support auditory presentations. Visuals can be so helpful. I find them extremely helpful to be able to remember what was talked about in lessons or in sermons. And also when we're teaching, whether it be a sermon or a Sunday school lesson, making sure that our lessons are well structured and engaging, and that we have a core truth that's clearly communicated and reiterated. And then a few ideas from Sunday school. Consistent routines are really important for individuals, especially individuals on the autism spectrum. Consistency is really important. Rules with clear consequences and follow through help students have a sense of safety and a structure in their environment, which is really important. One thing that we did this year was, and that we learned this year, is this cubby boxes idea. And Rachel, I think, is there, shared with, she's one of our teachers in the kindergarten room, and we have a little boy with Down syndrome who moved up to first grade this year. And one of the ideas that she shared with our first grade teachers is that when the little boy comes into his classroom, he wants someplace to be able to put his stuff. And we had cubby boxes in the kindergarten room. We didn't have them in the first grade room. So we got a set of cubby boxes. So now the whole class has cubby boxes where they can put their things, and especially the little boy with Down syndrome has his place along with everyone else. And then finally, finding alternate Bible translations is really important. Our curriculum through our first couple of grades uses the NIV, but the NIRV, the NIV for the Reader's Edition, is really helpful for younger, new readers. Well, I promised you that I would share with you our worship bulletin icons. These go into our actual worship bulletin, so we still have the words, that you would normally see in a worship bulletin, but next to each part of the service, we have these icons inserted that help non-readers follow along with the service so they know where they are in the service, what's coming up, and also give them a sense of time that sometimes we need to know, okay, how much more do I need to sit quietly? And so I just want to introduce you to these. In the top row, we have a man who is worshiping, being called to worship. We enter his presence. Next, the music notes indicate we sing his praises. Down on the knees is the prayer of confession, and lifting up our hands is the prayer of intercession. On the bottom row, we have our offering. We offer our gifts. Next, we have the message. Then we have the Lord's Supper. And finally, we have the benediction. And when we first introduced these icons, we went through each part of the service with children and talked through at length, really what each part's all about, so that when they saw these icons in their worship bulletins, they would have a better understanding of what's happening in each part of the service. Well, along with universal design, sometimes you need to have specialized design to bring individuals with disabilities into the worshiping community. And when you're using specialized design, you always want to start with the least restrictive. Again, universal design, person won't be singled out. But sometimes you do need to do things that are more highly specialized. And when you're trying to develop specialized design, I really encourage you to remember that parents of children with disabilities are going to be their best advocates and are going to be your best experts. So be sure that they are a part of the team in coming up with some specialized designs. So some ideas that I'd like to share with you. One of the things that our office does is they email the bulletin and song sheets ahead of Sunday to members who are blind. Another possible specialized thing is to just provide some quiet manipulatives like squeeze balls for children with attention or sensory disabilities who just have some extra energy that they need to be able to get out while sitting. Allow breaks to move around or out of the classroom or sanctuary, especially for people with ADHD. You might meet with the child's public school special educator to coordinate strategies, goals, and expectations. We've found that to be very helpful in being able to, we have a child for only an hour in Sunday school, and we want to know, well, what do you expect of them? Sometimes our expectations are too low, and when we talk with people who are with the child all week, they let us know, well, no, they can sit for 15 minutes, and that's good information to have. One thing that we did at one point is we provided respite care for a mom who just needed some time with her other children. So we developed a sign-up genius and invited people whose children were the same age as the child with the disability and others, friends of the family, to sign up to take the child with the disability for a few hours to have a special time of fellowship with that child, but also to give the mom and the family a break. We have also paid for individual caretakers for individuals with pervasive disabilities who need to be in an alternate setting. And sometimes you do need to modify your Sunday school goals or provide individual support in the same age or grade classroom. And then your most restrictive alternate for Sunday school would be to provide an alternate Sunday school program and setting for an individual with disabilities or for a group of students with disabilities. But we've been talking a lot about ministry to people with disabilities, but I also want to touch base this evening that ministry with people with disabilities isn't just about providing something to but also allowing people with disabilities to minister with us. Work is such a good gift from God. God creates us to work. He allows us to take pleasure in creating with him. And that is such a gift that we all need. And as 1 Corinthians 12:27 reminds us, we are the body of Christ, and individually we are all members of it. And it's important for each member to serve. So I liked the way this website, keyministry.org, phrased this idea. They said it's about being part of a ministry and not just a program. So some ideas of how people with disabilities might be able to serve with you include greeting and welcoming. I don't know about you, but I find a lot of times people with disabilities have a lot of the inhibitions that we have lightened, and they are really good at greeting and welcoming. They might be able to help pass out bulletins, collect offerings, participate in the music or worship team. There are some people who are really good at details, and they could help to renew supplies if you have a coffee area. I've had someone who's really good at sorting things, sort a ton of different colored coins for me for our VBS program, and that was really helpful. People can help with, of all abilities, can help with cleanup after fellowship meals. Teaching. Now here's a picture, and I had permission to share this. This is Lloyd and Judy Rasmussen, a husband and wife team who are blind. And Judy is our 5th grade teacher, and she's a phenomenal teacher. Now we have had to have her teaching materials adapted, and we've had a member of our church who has typed out the entire teacher's manual, and then Judy takes that to her people who help with adaptation, who translate it into Braille for her. But I would be at a real loss if we didn't have Judy on our teaching team. And finally, ministry with people with disabilities, praying. This is Stephen, and I also have permission to share his picture. When Stephen prays, he prays from the heart. I don't always understand every single word he says, but I know the Spirit understands. And when he's finished praying, the whole room says, Amen. So in closing, I do want to encourage you to not get caught up in or overwhelmed with details or complications. Just keep it simple. Remember your one thing. For us, it's Jesus Christ and him crucified. He has called us to share his grace and love. Everything else is gravy. So I just invite you to consider, what does that look like in your church? And finally, I have a number of references and resources that I've used for this presentation and also just used in my work. And I will have at some point this whole presentation up in the archives at Christian Ed Ministries. Thank you.
Dawn, thank you so much. That was a really helpful presentation. I know it helped me to understand better and to give me really creative ideas and things that I could always incorporate into the ministries that we do at our church as well. So thank you. That was really insightful and showed your years of experience. But more than that, it shows your heart for these wonderful brothers and sisters. Now, I want to thank you, too, for everything that you shared, but I want to give our folks that are listening the opportunity to ask a question if they'd like. You can either step in and click on your microphones to ask the questions now. You can type them into chat if you don't have microphone capability. But if you would like to wait until we cease recording, you can also choose to ask privately. Dawn will be staying on the line for a few minutes to answer those questions. So are there any questions?
And I'd also like to welcome people to share ideas, if I might.
Okay, that'd be great as well. If they have ideas that have been a blessing for their ministry, that'd be wonderful to share.
Hi, Dawn. This is Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really helpful, and especially that, the resource page. I want to read all of those resources. They seem really helpful. Mm-hmm. I had a question about, in terms of ministry to children and adults with disabilities. Once a church has developed, some infrastructure and really kind of adopted this as part of its mission, how does a church go about making sure it's known that people with disabilities are welcome? And do you think it's necessary that a church make an effort to make that known, or do you think it just kind of happens organically?
It's a great question, Rachel. I think that the church as a whole needs to decide, really what they want to do. I would caution against advertising that we have, quote, a disability ministry in terms of something that people will come in thinking that there's some kind of separate ministry that's the disability ministry. I really believe that our disability ministry needs to be integrated into the life of the church as a whole. And I think that when we look at the prevalence of disability in the general population, we're looking at about 20% of people, or 13% of students who have disabilities. I think when you start really tipping the apple cart, so to speak, with more people than is naturally occurring, it can really just have an imbalance, I think, in your church's society. I think it's important for churches within an area. I've been thinking about this lately, that it would be really good if churches within an area who offer disability ministries could team together and support each other, because all of this, one of the big things in special ed is really teaming. And it's so important to know that you've got people that you're working together with. And in special ed, you're going to have an interdisciplinary team made up of a variety of people who work with people with disabilities. And in churches, we really need to be able to come together and support each other, both within our church and across the community. I don't think we want to be, the church. I do want to be the church that welcomes people of all abilities, but I also want to have it balanced in a natural way. One of the things that really attracted me about Atonement when I first came here was that there is this natural inclusion of people with disabilities here at Atonement. Can we do more? Yes, we certainly can do more. And when people inquire, is this church friendly to individuals with disabilities? I sure hope the answer is going to be yes, and I sure hope that people just walk in the door and notice it, as I did when I first came here to Atonement. It was quite striking to me. I don't think we need to advertise, though. I'd be cautious about that, except advertising in the way that would be natural to a church. Like, I had a parent of a student with a disability say, would it be okay if I brought my friend who has a child with autism spectrum disorder to church? And I said, yes, please, of course, and we will work with that family. So being welcoming, yes. Advertising and saying that there's this, quote, disability ministry, I'd be a little cautious, though I would want to be able to say we welcome people of all abilities, maybe.
Thank you. I think that's wise. That makes sense to me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay. At this time, I'm going to take our recording offline. I want to thank you once again for joining us. If you want to stay online for further personal or private questions, you are more than welcome to do so. Dawn, thank you again for sharing your heart with us, and thank you to all of those who joined us this evening. The Lord bless you in your ministries. Good night.